Welcome back. As you can see there, Oluseun Onigbinde, the co-founder at BUDGIT, is joining me right now. Hello, Oluseun. Welcome to the program.
Nancy, hello Nancy. It's a pleasure being here today.
Happy New Year,
Uh,
Oluseun. How are you
glad to.
doing?
I'm fine. I'm good. It's good to join you from Lagos to talk about the 2022 budgets. Yeah.
Yeah. Now let's get started. The president signed the 2022 budget on the last day of 2021, and what he did send to the National Assembly was about 16 trillion naira on the 7th of October of 2021, and it ended up being jacked up to about 17 trillion. I think the highest so far in history in terms of nominal terms. How did you take this, the timeliness, as well as that overall figure of 17 trillion naira for this year?
Man, it's huge. We have to first say I appreciate the fact that we are now working in a streamlined budget process in terms of time. Before we had this haphazard approach of presenting the budget whenever we liked and also approving it at any time. But now we are seeing a scenario where the budget is presented October and it is approved in December. But it doesn't also mean that the entire process has been smooth as it should be. I think because of this rush, a whole lot of things were overlooked and there were a lot of errors in the budget process. And we will also look at the whole argument around insertion of line items in the budget. It's also been a part of the problems itself. Well, so far, it looks good. And the 17 trillion naira looks like a high figure. I mean, we have not done more than 4 trillion naira in terms of revenue in the recent years. Maybe the best we could rise to maybe is around 5 trillion if independent revenue performs properly. And if to get enough gains from the oil industry where pricing is already reaching around $80 per barrel. But the question is that is it on that premise that we are planning a 17 trillion naira budget? Because what we are seeing is we're seeing inflation, we're seeing deficit rising, we're seeing the CBN intervening in the economy beyond normal levels, and those are kind of things that will have a significant effect on the country on a continuous basis. But it also looks like it's an election budget. I mean, everybody is trying to take a grab something in. So you see around 6,500 projects, micro projects, most of them 5 million, 10 million, 20 million naira projects that were inserted into the project, which is not meant to be in the first place. But it's a step forward that we have the budget being done on time. But the question is that this rush, this push, is overlooking a whole lot of things that could have been done right. Yeah.
What do you think should have been done right? You've commended the president or this administration in the timeliness of the budget. And I must also say that the 13.6 trillion naira 2021 budget was being signed by Mr. President on the 31st day of December 2020. So he's followed the tradition, signing on the last day of every year the new budget. So he should be commended for that. What are the challenges that you're seeing, even though that the budget is being signed timely? That's one. Then the second thing is, I'm really not too clear on when this budget would start, if it has started or when it would start, because I also do know that there was a supplementary budget that was sent to the National Assembly for the 2021 budget to run till March 2022.
Yeah, so you're right. When does it start? The budget has started already. The recurrent component of the budget and the capital component of the budget has kicked off. What the president meant is that the capital project they would extend the implementation of the 2021 capital project till end of March this year, which is the first quarter of this year. And just because there's always that tendency of late release of funds for most of these projects. If we check, there's a platform called Open Treasury. And if you check the sheet for fund release, I'm sure December has not been published. You'll see that in the last 3 days of the year, there's so many projects are always funded beyond normal levels. So, and if you're giving the money for a project at the last day of the year, technically you don't expect that quality delivery would happen. So it's a good idea to do that, but we have to be more strategic in fund disbursement. And that comes from the whole idea that we don't properly, our budget is just a shot in the sky. We are not working with reality. It's part of our challenge with budget realism. Q1 of a year, what is the revenue that we expect? Are we budgeting in line with that regard? And or do we just wait till when we're able to raise funding in the last quarter of the year, and that's when we are now rushing to do things? It's also very accounts for the poor implementation of project. And when I say that, what should we have done right? Now, there's still always this pressure between the executive and the legislature around what is the how far can the legislature go with tampering with the budget line items as presented by the president. Now, because the budget itself is a law, so there's a legislature, you would expect that they have far-reaching powers to be able to check into the budget and to review them and to be able to analyze them and things like that. But one has to be really, really clear that the budget is an instrument of public policy. The budget itself is a mechanism to show how a political party or how a government is going to deliver goods to the people. So that kind of adjustment has to be strategic. But what we have seen is that a lot of people insert items in the budget because it's self-serving for them. In fact, one of the key element problems is the constituency project. You see a lot of items put in the budget are duplicated. You see some of them are even not put in the proper agencies that are meant to deliver them. They're not properly costed. And those are the kind of challenges that you have with the legislature just arbitrarily taking items and just putting them into the budget. It's not proper. But the executive have a way out of this. We're in a very busy year. If they choose not to implement those projects, then heavens will not fall. There has to be fiscal discipline in the budgeting process, which means the executive must say, what are the things that are of priority to us? We don't have enough funds, enough resources to execute all the projects in the budget. That's just a statement of fact. They need to focus on the project that deliver the highest level of good to Nigerians. But that is what we don't see at the executive level. It looks like anything that gets into the project, there's a possibility that just gets funded. You don't break any law by not funding a project. You break the law by funding what is not in the budget. So that's what I think the executive needs to have a grip of its whole process of distributing funds for projects. Because when we look at the 22 budget, it looks like it's a free for all. Every single item just passed into it. And at the end of the day, you begin to wonder, what is the benefit of this? I mean, we've seen a whole lot of empowerment and it's just most times executive or the legislature choosing a few persons, and maybe because of their political leanings or maybe because of some opportunity there for them in the future, they now distribute certain items to some people. Whereas when we started all of these empowerment projects, there were schools, there were hospitals, there were water systems, things that benefited people irrespective of their political coloration or the sympathy they have for any candidate. But now you have motorcycles being distributed, sewing machines being distributed, money is being given out, Tokumbo cars being distributed, and inside people are just using the budget as an instrument of political opportunity. There is no better way to describe corruption than to just put it that way. So for me, I think the executive needs that fiscal budget discipline, because if we think we can use the CBN vehicle to keep supporting our deficit and using debt to be supporting our deficit without an asset component on the other side, those are the things that lead to inflation. Those are the things that lead to the exchange rate even continuously being devalued, because we have so much naira in the system that somehow is chasing the dollar, and we don't even have commensurate funding from the dollar side to get those to be able to balance that out. So they are at the point the executive needs to be strategic around how it is releasing funds for a lot of projects in the 2022 budget.
I think you've just said it all, because at the end of the day, we've been talking about fiscal discipline for years. And it's not just about this administration, but perhaps this administration took it further than others. I'm not exonerating other administration, but if you take a look at even the fiscal deficit this year, it's around over 6 trillion naira, and it's above the ceiling that the Fiscal Responsibility Act has, recommended of about 3%. Our fiscal deficit now is above 3%. What do you think would ensure this fiscal discipline? Because it seems we've been talking. What else can we do? Agencies like yours or public advocates such as BUDGIT. You released the report, I think, last year, that we've seen so many projects padded, I think over 300. I remember I did talk to you last year on that. How do we ensure that fiscal discipline how do we ensure fiscal discipline is taken seriously? And whose responsibility is that?
So if you look at the fiscal, the 2022 project passed by NAS, the fiscal deficit is 6.3 trillion naira. 2015, we didn't even have a budget of 6.3 trillion naira. And if you would adjust for all the projections that have been made on the side of on the revenue side that are not realistic, because suddenly the executive feels, the legislature feels the independent revenue agency should bring 1 trillion naira, whereas they have not even been able to reach that mark in recent years. My own problem is that we're borrowing too much. We have a revenue problem. Everybody knows that we have a revenue problem. Everybody knows that our revenue to GDP is around 8%. A decent country revenue GDP is around 15 to 25%. Everybody knows that even our spending to GDP is low. So even as we think we're spending so much, it's 17 trillion naira national budget, which will represent around 50% of the total, of the federal budget, which represents like 50% of the total national budget. It's still relatively low. You're still spending less than 10% of your GDP by the time you take all aggregate government spending at the federal and at the state and the local government together. The challenge is that if you have little, then it behoves on you to be more effective and be more efficient with how you manage those resources. Now, it's just very unfortunate that in a time where your revenue framework is weak and you're borrowing hard to fix infrastructure, that's the time when you used to be able to entrench fiscal discipline. And those are the things that the current government, stood for, when it was running for office in 2015, that it was going to cut excesses, was going to cut facts, and they were going to build a country that, a tight ship that is governed by some ethical open opinions. But we don't see that in the budget. We don't see evidence of that in the budget. In fact, a whole lot of borrowings that we should have had should have been targeted, clearly tied to infrastructure. We have a bit of that, to be honest, but it is not as holistic and strategic as it should be. Funding the debts that we're having should be targeted to infrastructure. And then when we talk about fiscal discipline, it's political. Everything in Nigeria also just comes about the political interest into these things. The political economy into this. The leader of the government. Are they interested in fiscal discipline? Do they see the need for fiscal? Do they see the need to have a bit of control over items that keep being funded and be able to ensure that they represent opportunity for the public good? If the executive head of government does not see it that way, then every system just appreciates whatever it's, falls into line about whatever happens. So we have to keep putting it down on President Muhammadu Buhari to look into the budget. The only reasons why we had, there was a time we had finance and budget office separately. Then we said we were going to merge them back together. So we now have planning. So we now have Ministry of Budget and National Finance and National Planning. So the entire pipeline from planning to budget to actual financing is in a single agency. So it's very, very easy for you to have smooth coordination if you choose to want to make it happen. So say from the whole planning, this is the idea of what our governance would look like. And we'll make sure that is reflected in our budget. And we'll make sure that anything that is not fit into our planning, it's not funded. Those are the kind of messaging that we expect that the government should have. But it looks like it's just unfortunate that, even on the legislative side or on the executive side, there seems to be no proper coordination about public budget should be an instrument of planning. And we don't see that effectively at all.
Seun, let's take a critical look at the numbers. Some of the numbers are from the budget. Those numbers we've talked about, the fiscal deficit, 6.3 trillion. Let's take a look at the exchange rate at 410 naira to $1. Oil production pegged at 1.88 million barrels per day. That's the daily production. Have it in mind that we did not do this. We did not get up to our volumes last year. OPEC is also on one hand. America is also on one hand saying that we're going to open our taps. So I don't know how how realistic that daily production will be this year. For the oil price, it's been pegged at $62 from $57. What other numbers do I have here? Okay, capital expenditure of 5.4 trillion naira. Debt service expenditure about 3.6 trillion naira. Speak to me about some of these numbers, Sean.
I mean, if we look at the debt service of the country, that's one of the biggest pain points that we would have in the 2022 budget. You know, debt service was around, I mean, a trillion, less than a trillion as at 2013, 2012. Now, suddenly debt service now takes around 3.8 trillion. I mean, the target for debt service this year, including the sinking fund, is over 3.8 trillion. And we might even reach the 4 trillion mark in terms of debt servicing. And it's something that is worrisome for us because if, like I said, we don't do more than 4 to 4.5 trillion marks in terms of revenue of the country, no matter how much projections we make. And if you're spending 4 trillion around, I mean, as of November last year, January to November, almost 90% of every revenue earned by government was used in servicing debt. So in a way, that is extremely abnormal, no matter how much, wherever. You can't even find that even in war-torn countries. There is a challenge with how there's a conversation that needs to be held around how we look at our debt management strategy. It's hemorrhaging resources that could have been used for the public, and we just continue to borrow more without some form of some form of guidelines to say this is what we would borrow for, and the things we will borrow for will be self-liquidating. So whatever we are borrowing for, there's a clear business case for it, and we ensure that this infrastructure or whatever equipment that we are borrowing for can pay back itself over time. We won't just borrow because we just want to fix budget deficits. We want to borrow because we want to fix infrastructure, and we know that these infrastructures are viable in their own way. The thing about it is this: by the time you look at the old assumptions that were made, exchange rate 4 and 10, is that the true point of exchange rates in Nigeria? We know that most people, even in the retail end, would access exchange rate, from the parallel market, and that doesn't even reflect the rate. And we know those rates there's even been some slight devaluation in recent times, around 435, 437. We know that our production at 1.8 trillion, it should be feasible by the time you look at Nigeria's nominal numbers. Or we also know that production disruption, OPEC ceilings, and all that is there. The reality is that Nigeria needs to move its revenue classification, from a oil and a non-oil kind of category. That's just the reality. Every decent country runs its rubric or its infrastructure or whatever it's on taxes. So Nigeria needs to come to a country where it's a tax and a non-tax revenue. I remember when I was watching this program a few minutes ago, there was something from Ikechi that mentioned about the social contract needs to be fixed. And if you have something that underpins the social contract, it's about taxes and trust and a sense of accountability. Nigeria has to be a country that is governed by social contract. I'm just reiterating that. And the only way you can emphasize that is tax being a two-way system, the government making demands of the people to pay taxes, the people paying taxes with kind of understanding that it is properly used and it will be properly accounted for. Until Nigeria is able to change its paradigm of its own revenue architecture and pay extra attention on taxes. And if you are going to pay extra attention on taxes, it wouldn't just be, we're going to tax people to death. We also have to pay extra attention on sectors, on environments that will generate taxes. If we have a vibrant Nollywood environment, we'll double down on that. If we have a vibrant music industry, we'll double down on that. If we have a digital media that is expanding, we will double down to make sure that that's scalable. If it's going to be agriculture and we do it in a way that is mechanized and is efficient, we will scale that up. If it's real estate, yes, we will have to pay attention to that. So the entire tax architecture of Nigeria needs a reform. It's not just us saying we're going to reform PIA.
Okay.
The entire tax architecture, which component of government, which tier of government is getting what, needs significant reform. And now being able to build accountability mechanisms and trust mechanisms into all of that, because it's very, very obvious now. We will not generate by the projections that we have for 2022, the entire oil revenue is around 3.3 trillion. And then projection that we have for debt service, and that's a very, very huge assumption that we have made here, to even have 3.3 trillion.
Yeah.
The total revenue, the total amount we used to service debt alone is 3.8 trillion.
Yeah.
So in some sort of way, oil revenue can't even service Nigeria's debt anymore.
Okay.
So the reality, non-oil taxes is put at 2.1 trillion. The only but the government, the independent revenue was raised to 2.2 trillion.
Okay, Seun, I think Seun, can you hear me? Seun, I think we'll leave it at that for now.